Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Co-host today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. We have a special guest today.
Indeed.
Talking about an issue I talk a lot about, and it's so important. It has to do with the importance of money. He's been a friend for quite a few years, and I'm always fascinated with his books. Our guest today is Jim Rickards, and Jim, I want to welcome you to the program.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, great. And before we get started and ask you about your new book, I want to mention to the audience that you have you've been writing, and you've had several books on the New York Times bestseller list. One of my favorites has been the one that came out in 2014, I believe. It was Currency Wars. And I would think that the war is not over, but I think the war has already started, and we may be talking a little bit about that. But you also wrote something this year, the new case for gold. There's been an old case for gold, and it's probably very similar, but there is a case for gold, and another book you wrote was Death of Money. But your newest book is what we want to talk about, and this is called The Road to Ruin. And who wants to go to ruin? We want to have an election and solve all our problems. So we want to talk about that. So why don't you give us a brief update on this, and then we'll follow up with a little discussion on your book.
Sure, Dr. Paul. This is really the third volume of a projected quartet. So the books you mentioned, Currency Wars, Volume 1, The Death of Money, Volume 2, and this is The Road to Ruin, which is Volume 3. Also had The New Case for Gold. That was a tribute to work that you did along with others in the early 80s when the Minority Report of the Reagan Gold Commission was published as The Case for Gold. So my book was called The New Case for Gold, but that was a conscious tribute to your earlier work. But this is part of this quartet. What I do, Dr. Paul, is I look at the near collapse of the financial system in 1998. That was, the Russia long-term capital crisis. Then we had another near collapse in 2008. On both occasions, 1998 and 2008, we were just days, if not hours away from the complete collapse of every bank or the closure of every stock exchange in the world. That's not an exaggeration. That was well documented. I was actually very involved in I negotiated the bailout of long-term capital management in 1998, and of course we all recall 2008. So what I do, I take the story 10 years forward to 2018, but that's just an estimate. This is something that could happen tomorrow. And I make the point that in each crisis, the bailout gets bigger and the problem gets worse. So 1998, Wall Street bailed out a hedge fund. In 2008, the central banks bailed out Wall Street. In 2018, if not sooner, who's going to bail out the central banks? They haven't normalized their balance sheets. They haven't undone the work what they did, the money printing that they did after 2008. They no longer have the capacity to save the system. The next bailout's going to come from the International Monetary Fund with their world money, the special drawing right, or SDR. They've got the only clean balance sheet left. They're going to flood the world with trillions of SDRs. They'll finally get the inflation that they haven't been able to get all these years. The only safe haven will be, gold or other hard assets, land, silver, fine art. There are a number of things you can have, but I use physics, behavioral economics, and hard science to analyze this and explain to readers how this is going to happen.
Right. I think that your suggestion of what they might do is very much on, because that's why they were there. They thought they'd do this a long time, and SDRs are very important. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if they do exactly what you say. I don't think that'll be the answer, and because it's also going to be a failed fiat currency. But in the meantime, they're going to do something and contribute to the chaos. But I do have a question on timing, and you recognize when you make your predictions, as all individuals who understand the free market, is we may know trends, and we know that what inflating the money supply does, and all these things, and rigging, interest rates. But your book on currency wars, I think, was right on, because I believe we're in the middle of that. It's in the middle of this campaign because there's been charges, currency manipulations. We have to stop that. But right now, the one currency that I'm interested in watching, of course, is the dollar. And it looks like they're starting to sell some dollars, around the world, especially the Saudis and China. Do you believe that that's sort of cracking right now? Do you look at those charts where it say, we're getting awfully close because they're not rampantly leaving the dollar, but it suggests to me that they may be starting to. I just wanted to get your assessment on that and the timing as well.
Well, you're exactly right, Dr. Paul. There's no question that the Chinese, and certainly the Russians, they've seen their reserve position come down. The Saudi Arabians and others are selling U.S. dollar assets. They're selling the U.S. government securities. However, the reason we haven't had a big spike in interest rates is because the U.S. banking system is now captive to the Federal Reserve. So remember, as you know better than anyone, for every seller, there's a buyer. And the banks are being forced to pick up the slack. They are, they are the buyers of last resort. So, in 2008, the big banks were bailed out, and the bankers couldn't believe their luck. They said, hey, you saved my stock, you saved my bank, I keep my phony baloney job, I can still make million-dollar bonuses, and they felt that they had got a free pass. But what they didn't realize is that they were now working for the government. In the 1950s, a typical commercial bank balance sheet had about 50% Treasury securities, the rest, some mortgages and commercial loans. Today, that percentage is down around 10%, means there's a lot of headroom between 10% and 50%. This is what, as you know, this is what's called financial repression. So, yeah, the Saudis and the Chinese are getting out of treasuries, but the Federal Reserve and the bank regulators will force the banks to buy these treasuries. So there will be a ready market for them. But, of course, what that means is that the banks can't do anything else. They're just going to be big government bond funds working for the Federal Reserve. This is, one manipulation leads to another. Once you go down that path, holding interest rates low, inflating the Federal Reserve balance sheet, you have to keep going down the path. And the next step will be financial repression, where the banks are forced buyers of Treasury securities.
Right. Daniel has a question for you.
Yeah, Mr. Rickards, I was interested in your description of what this next crash may look like. You, of course, talked about 98 and 08, and you're saying somewhere around 18, but then again, maybe tomorrow.
Right.
And from, the U.S. military presence overseas, and you've been a consultant to the Pentagon and to the intelligence community, but, we have 800 military bases in 70 countries. That's a minimum. And the presence there is considered a stabilizing factor in a lot of these countries. But you mentioned in the coming crash, literally banks closing, no money for 2 weeks or what have you, people burning down banks. This sounds like something very dramatic at home. How would you see this affecting at least the perceived stability of the U.S. presence overseas?
Well, every great political power, whether it's an empire, seaborne empire, throughout history, there's never been a great power that didn't have a great currency. So when you see the U.S. dollar weakening and you see stress in our currency, that's almost synonymous with the decline of the U.S. ability to basically project authority around the world. Now, I once was at a meeting at the Pentagon with, they have a chief futurist. He has a different title. It's the Office of Net Assessment under the Secretary of Defense. But I was meeting with him in a secure facility in the Pentagon, and I said, the time will come when a U.S. destroyer will pull up at a fuel depot in Singapore, and you'll say, fill her up with fuel, and the dock operator will say, fine, pay me in SDRs. In other words, for the first time, you're going to have a very expensive forward-deployed military that you have to pay for in a currency that you don't print. And that really made an impact. They actually, I think the Pentagon understood this better than the Treasury and the Fed. I've had those same discussions downtown with the Treasury and the Fed, and they just assume the dollar will always be, king dollar. But the military understood that with a weak currency, you're going to weaken the military. So that is a threat to national security. As far as closing the banks is concerned, I do write about that in the book. And the point I make is that the best description of a financial panic I've ever heard is everybody wants his money back. People think they have money. They say, oh, I have money in the stock market. I have money in the bond market. No, you don't. You have stocks and you have bonds, but you don't have money. If you want money, you have to sell those things and try to get money. And, of course, in a panic, everyone's selling at the same time. So people actually don't really understand what money is. But in a panic, everybody wants their money back. In 1998, they printed the money and gave it to you. In 2008, they printed the money and gave it to you. But in the next crisis, the central banks are at the outer limit of what they can do. And the IMF, even if they try to print SDRs, and I agree with Dr. Paul, it might not work. They're going to try it. That doesn't mean it'll work, but they will try it. That'll take 6-7 months. Meanwhile, they're not going to give you your money back. Money market funds are going to suspend redemptions. Banks will be closed. Stock exchanges will be closed. And they're going to lock down the system. And people say, oh, that will never happen. But of course, in 1933, President Roosevelt closed every bank in America by executive order. And when he did it, he didn't say when they were going to reopen. Turned out it was about 8 days later. He didn't say that. For 5 months in 1914, the New York Stock Exchange was closed from July to December. All these things have happened before. The legal authorities are in place. Don't need an act of Congress. The president can do it with a phone call. So I'm just warning investors, get ready for that world where you may want your money back, but you won't be able to get it.
You know, another tool they have been using is this movement toward not allowing or not wanting people to use cash, the
Right.
Cashless Society. And how does that figure in? Because you said people want their money, and they don't realize that a stock or a bond doesn't immediately turn into money, especially when we have difficulty defining our money. So the fact now that a lot of people have moved away just out of practicality, it's easier to use a credit card. Does this help the establishment in doing this, the fact that people don't even think about cash? Is this a practical thing that they're doing, or do you think they're trying to get everybody out of cash for this precise reason, that they don't want people hoarding cash and they would like to have more control over the system?
There's no doubt about it. Dr. Paul, before you slaughter cattle, you have to herd them into a pen. And before investors and savers get slaughtered by the government, they're being herded into digital pens at one of a small number of banks. Negative interest rates are coming. We already see them in Europe, Switzerland, Japan, and elsewhere. They may be coming to the United States. We don't have them yet, but the Fed's taking a look at it. Well, if you put $100,000 in the bank with a negative 1% interest rate, what that means is you come back a year later, you only have $99,000. The government took $1,000, or the bank rather took $1,000 out of your bank account. Well, the easiest way around that, of course, is to take your money out of the bank, have physical cash, put it in a safe place, and you'll still have your money after a year. So they've got to get rid of cash in order to impose the negative interest rates. Now, people think that they can walk down to the bank and get their cash anytime they want. I have news for them. It's not that easy. Go to your local bank and ask for, $15,000 in cash. The teller's face will turn white. She'll call the branch manager over. They'll ask you, why do you want it? What's your business? They'll ask you for ID. They'll file a currency transaction report. That goes to something called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, government agency. You'll be put in a file right next to terrorists, drug dealers, tax evaders, etc. Bear in mind, you're a completely honest American citizen who just wants to get his hands or her hands on some cash. You will be treated like a criminal. If you take a smaller amount, maybe say $5,000, do that twice in a row. That's structuring, which is actually a crime, and they'll file a suspicious activity report. So, people ask me how the war on cash is going. I say, well, the war on cash is over. The government won. You may think you can get your cash, but you can't. Wow. However, you can still buy, real estate, income-producing property, gold. There are other tangible assets that will preserve wealth. But, to me, having some physical cash, it's, I live in an area where we get hurricanes. I have batteries and flashlights in case the power is out. Same thing. If the power is out, the ATMs don't work, the gas stations can't pump. It might be convenient to have some cash, but they're making it harder and harder to get it. And certainly for very large amounts, I would say impossible. There's a call to get rid of the $100 bill. Europe just got rid of the 500 euro note. They still have a 200 euro note. Ken Rogoff, Harvard professor, just wrote a book called The Curse of Cash, which is a manifesto to get rid of cash completely. When they take away your liberty, they always justify it. They say, well, we got to get rid of those nasty drug dealers and terrorists. Well, I did counterterrorism work for the government for 10 years. I have no sympathy for terrorists or drug dealers or tax evaders. But why is it always at the cost of liberty? Why aren't people at liberty to have cash if they want it? Well, the government won't permit it.
Right. Daniel.
Yeah, you touched on this already, Mr. Rickards, and I wanted to maybe circle back on it because I thought it was fascinating. An interview you did over the summer, you discussed another closed-door meeting you had. I think it was at the Pentagon, and there were senior think tankers, CIA people, they were doing some wargaming, and you referenced a senior Treasury official 2 seats away from you, and you mentioned that this next crash would involve the IMF, and obviously the dollar would take a hit. And he turned and said, "Don't you know the dollar has always been the dollar is the global reserve currency? It currently is today, and it always will be." And it struck me as the arrogance and ignorance of official Washington. Obviously, they're not even planning for these possibilities if they don't admit that they even exist.
Well, that's exactly right. I never. There's no need to mention names. I'm not out to embarrass anybody, but this was a senior United States Treasury official, and that was exactly the dialogue. I talked about the SDR, the same thing we talked about a little bit earlier, and he sort of harumphed and said, the dollar is the global reserve currency and has been for a long time and always will be. And I turned to him. I said, I feel like I'm on Whitehall. In Whitehall in 1913, listening to John Bull say, the sterling is always going to be the global reserve currency. And of course, by 1914, its demise had begun. And by 1944, the demise of sterling was complete. And so it's exactly when you take things for granted, when you're arrogant, when you don't look ahead, that things fall apart for you. So, I love America. I love King Dollar. I would like to see the dollar be the strongest currency in the world. I would like to see it gold backed. But even if it's not gold backed, I'd like to see a monetary policy that was preserving the value of the dollar instead of eroding it. But that's not what we see. We see the opposite. I mean, the Fed has a 2% inflation target. It sounds benign. 2% a year for 35 years cuts the value of the dollar in half. 2% for another 35 years cuts it in half again, meaning in a normal lifespan from birth to 70 years, the value of the dollar is cut 75% that's with 2% inflation. Now imagine 3% inflation or anything higher. It's a form of theft. To me, the inflation target should be 0. No inflation, no deflation. Just keep the value of the dollar as it is. And of course, gold is a good way to do that. But that's not what the government wants. They want to steal your money. They just want to do it slowly.
Jim, I want to finish up. We have to go shortly, but I want to talk a little bit about investments. You've already mentioned some hard assets that people can invest in. Certainly, you talk a lot about gold, and you do mention gold shares at time, but I think with caution. But if we take gold in the past year, right now, if you go 1 year back, it's up 16%. And gold, of course, has its ups and downs, but the long trend is there. Now, you have also made a suggestion with the election of Trump, if that occurs, that gold may well go up, $100. And this past week, Trump's political situation has improved, and lo and behold, gold has gone up and has jumped over $1,300. So I wanted you to just make a comment on that, but I also wanted to get your quick opinion on silver. You haven't mentioned silver, but it just seems like people who can't, they're overwhelmed with buying an ounce of gold. That I happen to have the belief that silver still is money, even though it's not emphasized nearly as much as gold.
Well, I agree with that, Dr. Paul. First of all, I own silver and I invest in silver. So there's no way. I talk about gold more because the funny thing about gold is it's actually not good for anything except money. Gold is probably the best form of money, but it's not good for much else. I mean, people talk about industrial uses. There are actually very few. Jewelry, but I consider jewelry to be wearable wealth. You look at an Indian bride, adorned with gold necklaces. That's her dowry. That's her life savings. So it's still a form of wealth. But the thing about silver, there's no way gold is going to the levels I'm talking about, where silver will not be along for the ride. So as gold makes its way to $10,000 an ounce, silver will make its way to $100 or $150 an ounce. The good thing about silver, just imagine a slightly more extreme scenario, and I don't think this is a stretch, where due to cyber warfare, the power grid goes down, the banks are shut. You have to sort of go out and find a farmer's market or something, buy groceries for your family. An ounce of gold is probably, a year's worth of groceries, and they picture people with chipping off a little bit of gold. But an ounce of silver, which has always been money throughout U.S. history until not that long ago, is probably the right amount for, a day's worth of groceries or a couple days worth of groceries. The U.S. Treasury has something called, the U.S. Mint, part of the Treasury has something they call Monster Box. It's 500 1-ounce American Silver Eagle coins. They're beautiful coins. They run, with $20 an ounce, they run about, say $10,000 more or less. But even if you buy 20 for, say, $400, it's a good thing to have. I mean, again, I consider some American Silver Eagles to be no different than battery and flashlights. It's an emergency resource that everybody should have. By the way, I should make it clear, Dr. Paul, I'm not a dealer. I don't sell gold and silver. I don't get a commission, but I do recommend it for everyday Americans.
Very good, Jim. And again, I want to thank you very much for being with us today. It's been a great interview, and I want to urge our viewers to take a close look at The Road to Ruin. And I think it'd be well worthwhile, and not even to forget about Currency Wars. That's another great book. Jim, thank you for being with us.
Thanks.
Good. And to the viewers, I would like to thank you very much for being with us today. I found this interview very interesting and very timely because lots of things are happening, especially on the verge of an election, and there's been a lot of predictions. But I think Jim has made some reasonable predictions that, in due time, there's going to be another major crisis, and he admits he doesn't know the day. But indeed, he says that it's very likely we can't get past 2018 without another major crisis. So I want to thank you all for tuning in today, and I would like you to come back soon to the Liberty Report.